Good morning, everyone. We welcome you to the Wednesday, March 6th meeting of the Board of Trustees for the Utah Transit Authority. We'll begin with the Pledge of Allegiance and invite you to stand and join us in doing so. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. We'll have our Safety First meeting with Sheldon Shaw.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, trustees. Appreciate the fact that we start off these meetings with a safety and security minute. There's nothing more important than safety and security in our system. This month's poster is an attempt to use humor to draw attention to a serious problem in society, which is that we're not paying attention to what's going on around us. And there are times when you really need to know what's going on. So that tweet or that text or that email is not important. You need to know what's happening, whether you're crossing the street, you're moving your way onto a rail platform, or you're leaving a building that's on fire. You need to worry about the task at hand. So appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Sheldon. It is a great message. As we mentioned, we time to time want to acknowledge employee groups that have done Herculean efforts, and we had one a few weeks ago with Transit Day on the Hill, and in the delivery of a wrapped bus. And I just wanted to maybe invite Lauren Simpson, if you would come up and just describe what your team went through. I think that's important, and then we certainly want to recognize those team members who helped us save the day there.
That's an interesting question of what we went through, or a way to phrase it. We were talking about it just the other day, and it seems kind of funny now. At the time, it wasn't very funny, and because we were concerned about the bus that was requested to be up there with a nice wrap and all of that being up there, and through a number of reasons, the bus wasn't there. And it was in service on a route. And so the folks behind me, maybe they could stand.
Yeah, and I'll just acknowledge I have Cheryl Posey, Debbie Skeen, Vincent Nguyen. Please stand up and stay standing. Tad Golding, Christopher Eisert, and Sarah Middleton. So, can we give them a...
I think there's another one, Dean Klebanoff. I hope we're not missing anything. But,
thank you.
This is where the whole group came together in about an hour's time. It wasn't any of their fault, but that didn't matter. They all owned it and scrambled like you wouldn't believe to be able to get that bus where it was. And so it's was a little nerve-wracking at the time to try to figure out how to get that bus out of service without affecting negatively our customers. Sure. But they did it. And I think what you see at UTA, it's nice to be represented or recognized because this is the kind of thing that they do every day, kind of behind closed doors, to pull off the service, overcome the challenges that the customer never sees. The bus just shows up. And so thanks for the recognition.
Well, I will say, for those who weren't familiar, the bus was wrapped in our upcoming commemoration of the Spike 150, or the joining of the two railroads. And when that bus drove up onto the Capitol grounds, the Box Elder County Commission, you thought you'd made their day, and they're obviously excited for a lot of reasons, but we're looking forward to a continued partnership as we approach that celebration, and your team's effort helped make that a great reality. It looks like, Kent, you might have a comment, or?
We heard from the bus driver that day that it was a real hit, that people kept streaming up, especially a lot of the young people that were up on the Capitol that day, just class after class wanting to get their picture taken by that bus. So it wasn't just the Box Elder County Commission. There were a lot of other people that got their picture taken that day with that bus. So thank you very much for the extra effort to all of you who made that possible.
Well, it's good to hear that it was all worth it. I also have to recognize the people who were there on the scene, and Andrea Packer and Eddie Cummins. That was a stressful moment for them, and they deserve kudos as well for making it all happen.
Beth, you.
So I wanted to be able to make a comment about this as well, because I was with the Box Elder Commissioners the entire day. I was in a meeting with them prior to this, and they could not contain themselves. They were like kids in a candy store waiting for Christmas morning or something. And you know, when it wasn't there, like at the first time that they showed up, it was like, oh, that letdown. But you guys pulled it off, and I just want to say thank you so much for all of your efforts, and they are thrilled. I was up at the Capitol yesterday and saw the wrapped bus. It was on Route 500.
Right.
Took a picture of it, sent it to Box Elder. They're still happy as clams. So
That's great.
Thank you very much for all of your efforts behind the scene and in the front.
Thank you.
And thanks to your staff. We realize that day to day you make those kind of things happen, and we don't hear about those things. And so thank you for the efforts there. So,
Thank you so much.
I bet. Our next item up is public comment. Bob?
Yes, we have one speaker today, Claudia Johnson.
Claudia?
I'd like to pay a compliment to the free riding on Thursday and Friday. I took advantage of it. I went to Ogden and Provo and was able to talk to a lot of people, and I really appreciated that opportunity. I met a lot of people that also were taking advantage of it. I must admit the ballpark parking lot was totally full and the side streets were full, and then I got a ticket because I was there for over 6 hours. And I was there, but anyway. So you had a real zealous policeman riding out. But I really appreciated talking to some of the people. They came from Brigham City just to ride, and they went down to Provo to visit family. I got to be able to see places that I could go and meet family and be able to do things. I appreciate that opportunity. I appreciated talking to college students that lived in American Fork, went to school, and then went to classes up here at the university or at the BYU Extension up here. And they rode it the whole time. So it was an opportunity for me to be able to see it and talk to other people. But there were a lot of people that were able to run and catch the train because they were going to be late with their children and then get off on tracks to meet their father or their family members to be able to spend time in town and do something that way and not have to expend a lot of money for children and for other kids that are going with them. I appreciated that, and I'm sure a lot of other people did too. So my hat goes off to UTA. You don't get the recognition that you should get. I appreciated Paul and Bob after the meeting last week that took the time to corner me? No, to talk to me and explain some things. And then I think I explained some things to them also, is terminology. What terminology you use is not terminology I would. As an example, ACA to me is American Camping Association. ACA to an alcoholic is Adult Children of Alcoholics. So what you say is understood by you, but I don't understand it. And I think that's where a lot of miscommunication happens, because I'm seeing, and I appreciate coming to these meetings because I do see you working hard for the benefit of the citizens. And it's not seen because I think of terminology and everything that goes into the general budget. How does it affect me as a writer? And what benefit am I getting out of that? And it's an education process, which who knows it'll ever happen. So you can't complain that way. But kudos to UTA. Kudos to you as trustees and taking over your responsibilities and doing a good job. To the managers that are here that I see, some that I know, some that I don't know, some that I'm getting to know, but I appreciate it, and I enjoy coming here and getting educated, and I wish more citizens would come and get educated also. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for that generous comment. We also acknowledge our other partners in that effort with Salt Lake County and Salt Lake City and Davis County and then of course Intermountain Healthcare. So it was a great partnership for those 2 days. Any other comments, Bob? Okay, thank you. Seeing none, let's go to approval of our February 27th minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I move that we approve the minutes of the February 27th, 2019 board meeting.
I will second.
Motion and a second. Any other discussion? Seeing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That motion passes. We'll next go to our agency report with our director, Steve Meyer.
Thank you, Chair. Just add my thanks to the team, to everybody at UTA who made the free ride days possible. There's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes to promote that, from our PR marketing group, the fairs people who work and turn off the ticket vending machines so that people don't pay by mistake, and then turn them back on. So we do get the money the days after that. Just a great team effort, the operations and the maintenance staff who made sure that all the people who rode those 2 days had a great experience. And hopefully some of those people tried it and will use it again. And I think that's a real benefit to the agency, and I think the legislature saw that, and you're seeing some movement up on the Hill to fund additional days of free fare days so we can help be part of that solution for air quality. Thank you.
Thank you. That brings us to item number 7 on our agenda, resolution authorizing the execution of an interlocal agreement between Salt Lake County and the Utah Transit Authority. Matt, you want to give us some background here?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning, trustees. Matt Sybil, Government Relations. So we talked about free fare days a little bit already. These were the 2 days last week of sponsored fares. So this was Salt Lake County at $25,000, and then the 3 other partners you referred to, Intermountain Healthcare, the Salt Lake City Mayor's Office, and then Davis County stepped in at the last minute. Like Claudia said, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence of new riders. I've been told by our analysts to stop bugging them and just wait for the data to come back. We're going to have a full report that we prepare, of course. A lot of us are excited about that. So this agreement with Salt Lake County was originally a basic funding agreement for the $25,000 in terms of the amount, and then there's some recognition that we agreed to that's in this resolution. They subsequently wanted to treat this as an interlocal agreement, even though it already went through. It's part of their budget, and it's part of the mayor's budget, but they wanted to treat this as an interlocal agreement, so that's why it's before you today.
Any questions for Matt? If there aren't any, I'll entertain a motion on this resolution.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to make a motion that we authorize execution of the interlocal agreement between Salt Lake County and Utah Transit Authority for the free fare days.
Second.
I have a motion and a second. Any other discussion? Seeing none, go to roll call.
Trustee Holbrook.
Aye.
Trustee Millington.
Aye.
Chair Christensen.
Aye.
It's unanimous. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt, for your work on that effort, and for those others that Steve mentioned. Oh, yep, don't go away, I guess. Thank you. That does bring us to our discussion items, and we'll have our government and legislative update with Matt.
Great, thank you, Chair. I'll be very brief and just kind of overview several things that we have, we're tracking and are moving forward. One of them is yesterday, you were all 3 were at the Transportation Committee in the House, where SB 72, which is the Transportation and Governance Funding Revisions Bill, was heard. Chair Christensen testified in favor of that bill. We've been a part of that process for many, many months. That's moving forward. It's likely to be on the floor of the House probably Friday or Monday. And so, of course, next week is the last week of the session. And so that's one that is it's a priority bill for leadership. They want to get that moved out and finalized. So I don't expect any issues with that bill.
Do we have any sense of when it will hit up for vote in the House?
Yeah,
I know they cleared the board and we're reprioritizing a few things.
Yeah, that's right. They wiped the board, I think, every day now. It's on its second reading. I would expect probably final passage next Monday.
Okay.
Yeah. So.
Okay. Sounds good.
Let me just cover off a few other quick items. You may hear more about this today when the Central Wasatch Commission folks come up, which would be great. But there's a Senate Concurrent Resolution 10. I know, Trustee Holbrook, you've been involved with this. That's a concurrent resolution urging smart transportation and land use integration, encourages us, UDOT, the transportation planning agencies, to work together to help in that effort. So that's a really positive thing for us. And just stop me at any time here too if you want to talk more about them or take any potential action as it were in any of these bills. Probably the biggest bill that it potentially would affect us that is being talked about in lots of circles is the tax reform bill, the Tax Equalization and Reduction Act. That's the Representative Quinn bill, HB 441. And that's the one that would fundamentally take the sales tax, broaden the base, apply it to services, fundamentally kind of shifting us into taxing services, which are an increasing component of our economy, lowering the rate on the sales tax on goods. And there's been a ton of discussion about that. We expect another substitute out later today or early tomorrow. And we're not quite sure where that's going to land. And there's lots of discussion about exemptions and local options and so forth. And I'll just leave it at that because we don't quite know where that's going to land. And you've all been involved with that one.
We do appreciate the representative's efforts. It seems like, and I was gone out of town last week, but it seems like he was very willing to listen to some of our concerns as they work through some of those issues.
That's right. We met with the sponsor, Trustee Holbrook and Andrew Gruber and myself, with the analysts on the bill, and then Trustee Holbrook testified last Friday with the League of Cities and Towns and with Bond Council that we want to help with this bill, and we really understand where the legislature is trying to go with this tax policy. So it was positive. And then just very briefly, so Representative Briscoe's bill, HB 353, the long title is Reduction in Single-Use Occupancy Vehicle Trips Pilot Program. That's the bill that would underwrite a certain number of days of free fare. So basically amplifying what we were able to do last week, tying it to air quality, bad air quality, so orange days leading up to red days. And so we'd work very closely with Department of Air Quality on this. And we've got a great relationship with that group. And so we've been watching that when it passed the House. It's onto the Senate now. And so we're going to try and help. The sponsors asked us to help shepherd that through, so we'll work with the Senate on that bill. The other one, of course, that we've been tracking, that we've been a part of for a very long time, is Senator Andregg's bill, the affordable housing modifications, which has some different definitions of what transit is. It really helps clarify how developers and cities can shape affordable housing close to transit. That's back it's back in rules due to the fiscal note on it. It's got a $20 million one-time appropriation and an ongoing appropriation as well. But that's another one. I think as it gets to the House floor, there'll be lots of debate on that. What is the role of government and affordable housing? But I feel pretty good about that one. I think it's going to be in a good place at the end of the day. And so why don't I leave it at that and take any other questions you might have?
No questions. I was, but do either of you have any questions on any of those bills? I was going to maybe suggest that we take a formal position on the Senate Joint Resolution, and I can't remember the number. I don't have it in front of me.
SCR 10.
SCR 10. The Briscoe's bill that's got the long name to it.
Right. That would be HB 353.
HB 353, and then Andrig's affordable housing bill, which we expressed support for, but weren't in a position to take a vote on it. So
that's right.
Does that sound amenable to either of you? Or?
Yes, I think that's a great. I think that's a very, very good idea for us to be able to voice our support in public meetings.
Do you want to make a motion to that effect?
Yes,
we'll take a formal position, or
I will make a motion that we support the Senate Joint Resolution number 10 with the central the land use planning with our partners. And I apologize, I couldn't remember the name of that bill either. Senate Bill 34 is the affordable housing, and then House Bill 353, which is the pilot program. That's where I'm going to go with that.
For free fair.
That for free fair days. That for hopefully for that's 1.7.
1.2.
1.2. Excuse me. $1.2 million. I move that we support these efforts in order to validate what our partners are doing.
I second that.
I have a motion by Beth and seconded by Kent. Any other discussion? Seeing none, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes. Thank you.
Thank you, trustees.
Thanks, Matt. We're next pleased to have a presentation on the Central Wasatch Commission, and we have Ralph Becker, the Commission Director, as well as Chris McCandless, who I believe is the board chair, and with John Thomas at UTA, and another guy that looks familiar, but with Jesse Dean, who everybody thinks you stole away, Mayor Becker.
We did.
Yeah, well, if there's a little button there, and your mic will light up, so if you'll turn your mics on, that'd be great.
Oh, there we go. Got it. Well, thank you for having us, making time on your agenda for us to join you. Just some quick introductions. Chris McCandless, who's going to lead this brief presentation, is the chair of the Central Wasatch Commission. All of you know him, I think. He's on the Sandy City Council and headed up the Jordan River Commission. Got that from basically birth to success. John Thomas, you all probably know as well from UDOT, and is heading up the Little Cottonwood Canyon EIS for them. And Jesse Dean's the Deputy Director of Central Wasatch Commission. So we're going to give you kind of a brief sort of introduction to ourselves as the CWC, and then talk about some things we're working on. So
that'd be great. Thank you.
I think most of you guys already know a lot about it, but perhaps folks in the audience don't know much about the Central Wasatch Commission. We were created as a result of the Mountain Accord project. Part of the 4 or 5 primary aspects of Mountain Accord was to find transportation solutions. Big Little Cottonwood Canyon was one of the primary goals, and then create federal legislation that protects the canyon and settles 40-year-long disputes between different factions, different groups, and different entities associated with canyon use and canyon land ownership. One of the aspects was to create a new entity, which is the Central Wasatch Commission, so that we could try to create ways and means from which we can implement the objectives of Mountain Accord. So the Mountain Accord document itself, which was signed by 88 people and numerous others electronically, becomes more or less our Bible. That's our job description. And part of that was to form the Central Wasatch Commission. Four original communities formed the Central Wasatch Commission through that mandate, which was Salt Lake County, Salt Lake City, Sandy City, and Cottonwood Heights. After that was formed, Mayor Dolan lost his bid to become serve another term, and appointed me at the end of 2017 to be the Sandy City representative, which we started out on a very interesting journey I didn't know it was going to be about a 30-hour-a-week job, or maybe I'd have taken a second thought. But it's a great task, and it's a neat responsibility to be charged with. And from that time, we've now grown to 10 members. Our 10 members are 9 bodies that are elected. We have Park City, the town of Alta, Summit County, Salt Lake County, which has 2 representatives on our board. Mayor Wilson now has replaced Congressman McAdams. And Salt Lake City, Mayor Biskupski is on there. I'm trying to know Cottonwood Heights, Mayor Peterson. Am I forgetting people? Oh, Jeff Silvestrini, one of our newer members from Mill Creek, obviously was an easy choice to have an admin, admit them to our membership. And part of the challenge has been we started from scratch. It was absolutely nothing. And so we had to create policies and procedures. And if we want to admit somebody to our organization, which makes perfect sense for Alta and Mill Creek and Park City, now as a Park City membership, not Wasatch Back membership, we had to come up with a new documents. And that was the case with absolutely everything we've done is starting from scratch. So it's taken us about a year or so to get that organization up and running. Last July, we hired our executive director, which was Ralph Becker. Absolute brilliant choice on our part. He knows every inch of the mountain. And so we process now of putting together the 2 primary aspects of Mountain Accord: transportation, legislation. It is the transportation piece and the federal legislation piece that we believe Utah Transit Authority will play a significant role. And so with that said, I'll turn time over to, oh, and by the way, one of our members that I failed to mention is Carlos Braceras. The state of Utah, Governor Herbert made that his choice for representation on the Central Wasatch, which has been great. And Carlos has lent us John Thomas, which we've abused greatly, and appreciate his service to us as well. So I'm going to turn it over to Ralph, let him cover some of the things that you'll probably be a little more interested in.
Okay, thank you. Just by way of a little background, additional background in terms of the transportation piece, a few weeks ago, I pulled out the 1989 Wasatch Canyons Master Plan. It was done by Salt Lake County. And there's a very long, detailed section and explanation on transportation issues. You could read that document today, 30 years later, and the exact same direction and guidance would be applicable. It has said, look, we've got to develop a mountain transportation system, we've got to solve congestion issues, and set out some criteria for doing that in a process. But it takes a crisis, as we know, and sometimes in our way of doing things in government to kind of get everybody's attention. Well, this year we have everybody's attention because people are spending 4 and 5 hours trying to get in and out of these canyons on snowy days, or if anything happens, an accident or anything happens in those canyons. So we do have everyone's attention, and that serves us well in many respects. People are incredibly impatient, understandably, because this should have been done 20 years ago, right? Not today. But everyone is very focused and wants to get these solutions not only concluded on, but implemented yesterday. And fortunately, we have an incredible commitment. The legislature in 2017 appropriated $100 million for recreation area improvements, 66 million, John can correct me on all this, if I get it, don't get it quite right, but $66 million of that went to Little Cottonwood Canyon. And then there was actually additional money on top of that to handle certain things. With that, UDOT initiated an EIS, and I'm going to let John and then Jesse talk about these 2 elements, the Little Cottonwood Canyon EIS, and then as that has unfolded, they realized that all these tangential sort of ancillary issues that really need to be integrated into the EIS that aren't purely transportation or a longer term needed to be developed concurrently. So they came to the Central Wasatch Commission at the end of last year and said, will you co-lead with us a transportation action
action plan relating to Big and Little Cottonwood Canyons. So since then, we've picked up that element. Jesse Dean is taking the lead on that. We're using, as part of the Central Wasatch Commission, we have a 35-member stakeholder council. There are over 100 applicants to that council, but representing the incredibly diverse interests on the Wasatch Front and the Wasatch Back that, have particular responsibilities or interests relating to the mountains. So they're being used as almost as an advisory board to the Central Wasatch Commission, but also to try to build consensus around what is going to be done, because we're all experts in transportation, and on this matter, everyone has an opinion about what the solution should be, and there's a lot of variation in what that should be. So we're working short-term and long-term to address that. I'm going to turn time over to John and to Jesse, and then maybe we can talk a little bit specifically about some things we can see as it relates to UTA.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, trustees. In 2017 legislative session, a bill was passed, Senate Bill 277, that appropriated $100 million for recreation hotspots. And those were areas identified that were crowded, had significant recreation activity and economic activity for the state. And so the department went through a process to identify those areas, and then the Utah Transportation Commission prioritized those areas. And they prioritized the St. George area, and they allocated out of that $100 million, $15 million for St. George area to look at transit between St. George and Springdale to address congestion there. They also looked at allocated funds to Moab to build some parking in town that would then be transit centers for other activity areas. And then in Bear Lake, $8.3 million went there to help with the new marina and other activities around the town there, other elements around town. And that left $66 million for Little Cottonwood Canyon. And the commission directed the department to initiate the environmental impact statement process that we started last year about this time. And in a few months, we started to recognize that some of the things that Director Becker identified, that there are a lot of issues that aren't just singularly solved by expanding the road or other things that UDOT's really capable of doing. And so we recognize some of those things that also couldn't be addressed in one canyon without addressing them in both canyons. Transit, for instance. How could we describe a transit improvement for one canyon and not another? How could we have a tolling discussion in Little Cottonwood and not in Big Cottonwood, or maybe even statewide? What does our first step look like? And communications, other aspects that really started to identify. We couldn't look at some things within just Little Cottonwood in absence of Big Cottonwood. So we went back to the commission and asked, the department asked if it would be appropriate to allocate some of that $66 million to study Big Cottonwood as well. And the commission approved that, and that's when we started the second effort called the Transportation Action Plan. And that's where CWC will come in, and then Jesse will explain that Transportation Action Plan in a little more detail. But what we learned in the EIS process in those first few months, when we started a year ago, started the process, we started to get public input, hundreds of comments. And what we started to sense was people were very informed in this area about the topics and issues. Combined with what Director Becker mentioned, studies from 1989 onward, there's over 20 studies. People are very frustrated about being asked, what do you think about transportation? They're like, get something done. And we're very fortunate that we have some money that's programmed, ready to go. And so we started to think, well, what could we do with the money we have and do reasonable, practical improvements with what we have? We're not going to solve all the issues. Not going to make everything go, all the problems go away. But could we do make things a little better, some choke points? Could we make some things better with safety? And we found some things that we are pretty confident in, and we're focusing the EIS on that. And those things are avalanche mitigation. Little Cottonwood Canyon is the highest risk corridor in the world, as I understand from our experts, for avalanche. And it's due to the amount of traffic on the road and the proximity of over 40 different avalanche chutes. 3 of them are most problematic, and those are the ones that we're looking at some alternatives, including bridging around it, putting up some fences, walls, berms that would redirect it, and even snow sheds. And snow sheds we've looked at quite a bit. They seem reasonable, and we'll be evaluating those in the EIS. Also, we have some choke points. One down at the bottom of the canyon where 94 South comes into Cottonwood Canyon Road. You know, you've got about 1,500 cars trying to go up one road and about 1,000 trying to go up another into a road that carries about 1,000 beyond that. So there's a choke point there, and we've got some ideas to improve that, also improve bus circulation in that area. But these are just, they're going to improve the situation some of the time for, you know, some of the conditions. At the top of the canyon, we have another choke point, and that's at the ski areas. When people trying to get out of the ski areas in the evening, it gets quite crowded and congested. People might sit in the parking lots for a while. It can take some problems there. So we instituted some, the department implemented some temporary high T intersections. They're just a method to allow the parking lots to come out a little easier. It's low cost, high impact things. And so as we looked at the winter, there's also summer activity in the canyon. And so we're looking at 3 different trailheads. The trailheads in the canyons are often inundated with visitors in the summer. And we're looking at how do we address that. We've worked with the Forest Service to identify what might be appropriate to further analyze in the EIS process. So 3 trailheads, and then also Wasatch Boulevard. As part of the long-range plan, Wasatch Boulevard is a regional transportation facility. It's been in a long-range plan for a number of years. It's come through the process and is now ready to be funded and implemented for its future life. So we're looking at those 3 elements for the EIS. And in that, I want to also stress, we started the process with the EIS a little different than we have in the past. We asked, because of UTA's and the Forest Service's critical role in this, to be partners with us. And so on all of our meetings, all of our joint decisions, we cooperate, we collaborate on making joint decisions on what's most appropriate from UTA's perspective, UDOT's perspective, and the Forest Service. You might mention UDOT has an easement on Forest Service land in the canyons for most of our roads. So very important for us to have that understanding. And that's kind of set the stage of how we started to understand things. And when we understood that we needed to have another process to address these bigger issues of tolling, transit, gondolas, trains, roadway widenings, both canyons, that's when the discussions began between Director Braceras and Director Becker. Could there be a partnership there between the two agencies? And so with that, we started it, and we did the same thing, kind of different than what we normally do at UDOT. Could we co-manage that? And that's where Jesse Dean is now the co-manager of that effort and provides the communication and insight and direction for the project. UDOT, the Forest Service, UTA, is support to Central Wasatch Commission to help them achieve their goals with transportation that way. So with that, I'd like to maybe turn it over to Jesse and have him explain the TAP part.
Thanks, John. I guess I wanted to start off just by saying, kind of a comment about how we think about transportation in the canyons. Director Becker also mentioned this, that everybody's a transportation expert, but that we have this idea that we want to think about golden bullet solutions. Whether it's with a road, whether it's with a transit project, but really it's more about a comprehensive view about how we think about transportation and transportation-related improvements. They're all interrelated, whether we're talking about parking, whether we're talking about trailheads, or we're talking about the toilets or restroom facilities at the bases of these trailheads. But they're all, or if we're talking about getting people up to go skiing in the winter. But really we're looking at, year-round recreation issues in the canyons and the transportation issues that stem from those. So I think that that's really where the direction was with UDOT in terms of understanding the commission's role, and that there isn't any one agency, but rather, finding a group that can coordinate among all the different agencies within the canyons who have jurisdiction in the canyons, but also really engage with the public. Director Becker mentioned our Stakeholders Council, which is comprised of recreation, environmental, academic interests, and even citizens at large, just who have a lot of passion for these canyons. But I think our idea with the Transportation Action Plan is to coordinate both the short-term and the long-term actions that we take in the canyons so that the investments we're making today can help to pave the path for future investments we're not going back to try and start off in the beginning. But we also recognize that we can't just sort of wait for that ultimate, whatever transportation system it looks like, whether it's a gondola or a rail or whether it, or additional bus infrastructure. But really, we have to start chipping away in a methodical fashion about, tackling these transportation issues. So as part of the Transportation Action Plan, a lot of the work that we'll be doing is developing a prioritized list of actions for the canyon that the commission then can either go after funding for or work with different partners in order to actually implement. These can be things that are small that we begin to implement this summer, depending on their environmental process or public process required. But all with that idea of talking about some of the longer term issues right at the same time, so that the decision making is coordinated. So when I'm saying longer term issues, again, we're talking about tolling. We're talking about significant parking infrastructure at the bases, whether it's at the gravel pit, for example, in Cottonwood Heights, or 9400 South in Highland for Little Cottonwood. But I think, again, if we think about this as a comprehensive picture for transportation, it's not just another planning study, but really a series of coordinated actions with the commission. And I think as part of that, we have a technical group that we have with UTA and the Forest Service, UDOT, and the other jurisdictions. But we really need that, engagement with UTA, and that we've had that thus far. But that's something we're really excited about as part of this, action plan process.
So we're really fortunate, I think, with CWC to have this partnership. And you can appreciate when you see the number of people it takes for you to conduct a meeting. And you've got 2,800 employees, 2,600 employees with UTA. In Carlton, I know we had 3,000 employees in Salt Lake City.
Yeah.
We have a staff of 3 people to run a government. So it's an interesting challenge. Fortunately, we've got enormous volunteer direction and support and work. In fact, all the jurisdictions have been stepping forward, including UTA, in different ways to really allow us to do our job, because there's no way 3 people can run a governmental agency, I've learned. Anyway, so we're very fortunate in that regard. There is no question in anyone's mind, well, there are a few exceptions to this, that the key to solutions is going to be transit. Getting more cars up and down these canyons is not a solution. The roads are choked. Even if you were to add a 3rd lane, which is one of the options that be looked at and dedicate, that's not going to do it by itself. There's just no more room for parking unless you start building structures up on the top, but then there isn't capacity in the road. So I think everyone's recognized for a long time that transit is the key component, certainly a key component, in what the solutions are going to be. We've been working at the staff level with Laura Hansen and Levi and some folks on your planning staff kind of day to day, but there's no question, I think, that at the end of the day, we're going to need to coordinate with you on allocation of resources for in the short term buses and in the long term for what the right transit solution is and UTA's role in that. So when we started Mountain Accord, I think people were really thinking, and UTA, in fact, was really an advocate. And Steve, you've been involved in this forever, so you know it from a number of angles. But hey, trains are a really viable option. There were trains up and down both Big and Little Cottonwood Canyons. They got the minerals out, and those train corridors and paths are still there. And the thinking was, well, maybe we connect to the mainline rail system in the middle of the valley, come up through Sandy, go up Little Cottonwood Canyon, tunnel through. You can walk today by tunnel from Little to Big Cottonwood Canyon, tunnel through to Big Cottonwood Canyon, and then potentially to Park City. As Mountain Accord unfolded, we realized we both didn't have the information, and there were dozens of different opinions about what should be done. So in many respects, while all those options were left open, there weren't any decisions made. And I think we're hoping and really expecting that through this process we're going through with this Transportation Action Plan, that we will settle on, by some consensus, what the approach should be long term. So obviously UTA is going to play a critical role. We're fortunate that UDOT is devoting a lot of resources for us to bring in the expertise to help advise the group trying to bring about some direction on that. Short term, though, I don't think there's any question that we're expecting there's going to be additional buses, whether that involves a third lane on canyon roads that's dedicated or partially used for this purpose, or whether it's just improving delivery times and having more buses available. Those are things we hope to work through actually pretty quickly. So we're hoping that you'll be really very directly involved, and you have been at the staff level, but as we move forward, in trying to get some consensus around these decisions. I live downtown, just a few blocks from here. I decided a few weeks ago I was going to take transit to Alta to ski. There used to be express buses from downtown and from the university. They're gone now. I had no problems with traffic. I avoided the crisis times, or tried to. It was 2 hours each way. And there were still people doing it, which is amazing. But, you're not going to get many people from downtown or from the university, from Salt Lake, where a lot of people leave from, to go to these resorts if that's the best we can do for them. I mean, not only is it the time, it's lugging all of your equipment and just not having a very convenient way to move by transit. And I think unless you're living in Sandy, literally, that's true for everyone in this valley. So those kinds of things, if we're going to come up with transit solutions, and if in the short term that's bus, we're going to have to find a way to work with you to address, because we've got to have transit as a key part of the solution. So I just throw those out there. And
I think one of the most interesting statistics that I've heard through this process is that if you take the trips in Big and Little Cottonwood Canyon by individual vehicles and tally that number, it exceeds the total number of vehicle trips in Yellowstone National Park. It exceeds the total number of vehicle trips in all 5 national parks in the state of Utah combined. And so our challenge is that for 30 years, we haven't really done much, largely because we've got these 2 significant factions, one side to the left, one side to the right. You get to decide who's on the left and who's on the right, that have been at odds and have fought each other for a very long period of time. The beauty of the Mountain Accord document itself is that those factions came together and said, we really need to fix this. And one of the issues is federal legislation and trying to make sure that both of those factions agree to the rules moving forward. And it was really fun to have the CEO, president of Snowbird, now Dave Fields, and Save Our Canyons representatives seated at the same table with us in Congressman Curtis's office saying, let's do this. And it is absolutely critical that we have Utah Transit Authority part of the equation. We know that because you guys are the transportation, and so we're pleading and asking for your participation and your assistance in all the decisions moving forward. Because the answer, as Ralph said, is not more cars, it's mass transit in those canyons, because we cannot continue to do what we're doing. 30 years from now, I won't be here. In fact, I won't be here by the end of the year. I have to be an elected official to serve in this capacity, and I'm not running for re-election. And so I don't want to look back and say, we had another shot, we had everybody together. We need to move it forward now. 30 years ago, Ralph was seated at the very same table as a private enterprise individual planning this plan. So all the help we can get is much appreciated, and just open it up for any questions you guys might have of us, and look forward to working with you as always.
First of all, thank you for being here. As each of you were going through your portion of it, I thought what a great team. I still have in my garage a Legacy Preserve sign that John Thomas gave me, and I can't bring myself to getting rid of it. And And then certainly, Chris, your enthusiasm, and Ralph, your leadership. And then Jesse, of course, always gets stuck with making everything happen. So, and does a great job. So thank you, all of you, for that. One question I guess I have is, as obviously as the Central Wasatch, just from a jurisdiction standpoint, who at the end of the day will make a decision? Does that fall? My memory serves me that Central Wasatch doesn't have that authority. Does that fall to the Transportation Commission, and or how does that get, the plans, how do they start to get implemented?
So in a collaborative environment of trying to understand what are the appropriate solutions, we envision the Central Wasatch Commission providing that guidance and direction for the preferred actions and a priority. But it'll be up to each of the jurisdictions or agencies to implement their responsibilities. We're not ceding that to the commission. UDOT's not ceding that, but we're in cooperation and collaboration with the commission, the Central Wasatch Commission.
Yeah, one of the really nice elements of the Central Wasatch Commission is just how well we work together. We've been doing this since before I was born. I've been on so many boards and commissions and councils that it's been a great ride. But we are so cohesive and so unified of those 10 members. It is exceedingly rare that our vote is not anything other than unanimous. In our recent deliberations on the federal legislation, very contentious, our decision was unanimous to support the recent draft, which includes transportation pieces. And so that's pretty unique. Usually there's some bickering and little territorial issues with this type of a decision, but not this time. So we all recognize that it's important, that we're trying to move it as fast as we can. We do have to follow the process, which is, as you guys know, very cumbersome and time-consuming, but we're pushing it pretty hard. And so with that, we'll make those decisions and recommendations to those bodies. And then similar to SCR 10, the resolution we have on the state level, we're getting some great responses with regards to that. It's necessary for us to have that so we can continue to move forward, because not everybody loves us. There's a couple, 2, maybe 3 people that don't like us. And I'm kidding, of course. But we've got some great support for what we're doing across the board, with those exceptions. And so our job is to make it happen through those entities associated with the decision-making rights.
And if I could, just as a follow-up, so we're commencing here later this month, and it's really has to do more with Salt Lake County and our general service level allocation, and as we go through a service planning effort, but ultimately to help us lead us to some decisions, 2-3 years from now about how we allocate some new transportation dollars. What's the timing of the EIS completion and recommendations, and what should we look at so that we understand maybe more fully what maybe the transit expectation is?
Thank you. So you've got a sheet that I think has been made available a little bit that sort of summarizes the process and the roles of UDOT and the Central Wasatch Commission, CWC. Basically, we're looking at the rest of this year and next year for, I'd say, the basic decision making with sort of finalizing that in 2021. But as has been mentioned, we are not waiting for those decisions to be completed for things that don't involve an environmental impact statement decision. So anything that isn't major infrastructure, and a lot of that's bus service, right? I mean, that's not going to take an EIS to be able to determine how to and best to increase bus service into these canyons or in the interim, right? Or to even make some of the longer term decisions about what the right mode or combination of modes is to serve these mountains, the Wasatch Front and the Wasatch Back. So I'd say we can move almost as quickly. Our Stakeholders Council has already started on considering transportation
stuff. But I would say this year, by the end of this year, if we're fortunate, and I looked at John and Jesse because this always drives them crazy when Chris and I are pushing the envelope on this in terms of timing. We should have a lot of sort of basic decisions about what some of the best transit improvements could be. And we've got your folks working really closely with that. So you could tell us your timeline, and we can hopefully adapt so that as you're making your resource allocation decisions with the new money and reallocating whatever, your existing money, we can make those in a way that fits into your timeline. We would hope that because of the problems and challenges we have in these mountains today, we know the pressures you face in these valleys, and we're way behind on catching up with transit service. But it is, I would say, equally important in these mountains, and it's smaller and more focused, so maybe it'll be a little bit easier in a way to sort of focus some resources there as you're looking at your bigger picture.
I think John had a really important comment about the purpose of the action plan not being another study. One of the parts that we've really pressed on in the scoping period is trying to think about how we maintain funding pathways for each of the projects. The people who are engaged in these mountains know a lot about transportation. They may have specific goals and what they think is right, but we need to refine those options early so that we can make a determination about some of the other programs we're doing. Again, tolling and some of those transit alternatives are very important for us early on for our decision making, but as are those funding pathways. We don't want to have this come down to a process where we've just said, great, we think this specific project's right. How do we fund it, or how do we engage with partners? That's the reason why this commission is trying to do this all cohesively, so that we can provide everybody with the right information at the end of the completion of the study, so that they don't have to go through multiple more years of sort of those funding conversations to the extent possible.
Questions, Beth?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I wanted to echo what Chair Christensen said in terms of wanting to make sure that we're as engaged as possible. I know some of our staff has been involved in this, and I'm learning a lot. I wasn't aware of a lot of this, and I had an opportunity along with Trustee Millington to go and tour the canyons last week. Was it only last week? It seems like a lot longer. And I actually had a chance to sit next to Jesse and we really had a good opportunity to get some background, at least for me, to get me to the level where I'm understanding this. And I appreciate that you want to make sure that this is a cohesive, comprehensive approach, and something that's not just say, oh gosh, this is a wish list, and this would be super awesome, but we don't have any other way of funding it. I'm speaking for myself in terms of, I want to make sure that we're understanding what the goals are of the group and engaging in the way that is going to best fit that, and taking into account the funding mechanism. So I know that this is going to be a key component. We've heard from a lot of different people, even in the week that has passed. I've heard from people that have said, I heard you went on that tour and got an opportunity to talk to people, which was fantastic. We actually got to meet with all 4 of the resort general managers and really understand some of their needs. And you're right, there are a lot of people that are, oh, I know what we should do for transportation. Here, let me lay it out for you right now. Which was great. It's great to see their enthusiasm. So it's kind of just, it's not a question, because I think that the key question I had was the EIS, and I wondered how that incorporating Big Cottonwood Canyon kind of changed the timelines on that. But if it didn't substantially change it, then that's great. So anyway, this is a long-winded thank you, and great opportunity, I think. And you're right, we probably need to be looking at this. We do need to be looking at this now and making sure that we're making decisions for the future. So thank you for that opportunity, and thanks for attending today. So.
Maybe one final question. John, we obviously serve other canyons, and certainly Big and Little Cottonwood probably sort of exponentially have bigger challenges just because of its narrowness and the windiness of the roads. But will there be some aspects that can come out of this that could be used in some of the other canyons along the Wasatch Front, particularly where we have other ski service and even summertime use?
Yes, I think a very direct connection between the work we're doing now will help us guide future activities. One of the things we're learning that was unexpected to me was the importance of water quality and the watershed. I didn't understand that surface watershed and how important that is, and the risk that a road right next to it has, and where's UDOT in that discussion. And so that part's raising our awareness of elements. Also, just having this relationship with UTA and understanding, how do we partner in identifying what can we as agencies both do at a measured pace that fits the agency's directions, rather than saying, what is that wish list? And, we can't get to it. Well, let's, we'll move on to another study. And so we're trying to take those lessons, and I think the canyons are helping us focus those efforts in a way we might not have done in the past because of the pressures put on us for trying to find those solutions.
Any other questions? Maybe, Steve, if we could ask of you or your staff as the work progresses and there comes some decision points, especially the stuff that's going to affect transit, it might be good to bring that portion back and help us follow along in the decision or the discussion process. That would be great.
Certainly, will do.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for including us, and we look forward to working collaboratively with you. Thank you. Well, there's...
The best part about this job is we have a dress code that includes plaid.
Yeah.
And
no ties. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Ralph. We're next up for discussion is the future front runner, and this is part 1 of 3. We know this is going to be an important and great discussion. Steve?
Great. Thank you, Chair. This is going to be a 3-part discussion. We wanted to set the table as similar to what we're talking about with the canyons, different areas. We're talking about improvements and what does the future hold for us. And front runner is certainly one of those areas. So over the next 3 weeks, we want to give you some background, some details of work that's been going on, and what we need as far as help to keep this moving forward on front runner to continue to make improvements. We're seeing some pretty significant increases in ridership with UVX. We topped 20,000 a day on ridership there on front runner. So, and during the peak times, we're at or near capacity for those vehicles that we currently have. So this week we want to talk about a study that UDOT did talking about the transportation capacity needs north-south, not necessarily just purely looking at transit, but looking at all modes and what the growth of the Wasatch Front is going to do to that, and how are we going to meet the transportation demand in this rapidly growing region in this portion of the corridor. So that's a study that UDOT led out on. Jeff Harris is here, Director of Planning with UDOT. Is that right? Yep. And he's going to talk about that. Next week, we'll talk about the future front runner study that we had commissioned with a consulting firm. Carrie Doan in planning led that effort, and she can report on some of the findings of that. And then the third week, we'll talk about now what are the challenges for us moving forward with improvements to front runner to help reliability, to increase capacity, things like that. And we'll talk about the next steps we see going forward. But turn the time over to Jeff to talk about this really important study that UDOT has done.
Awesome. Thank you very much for allowing me to come and talk about the Wasatch Front Central Corridor. I love to talk about this study. I think it's was groundbreaking in the way that we looked at it. Right at the beginning, it says planning differently. Well, what does that mean? The word solutions was thrown out quite a bit today, and I think it was a recognition. Well, let me back up even a little further. What was the genesis of the Wasatch Front Central Corridor study? when I came to UDOT in 2012, we completed the regional transportation plan along the Wasatch Front, and there was one glaring omission in all of those plans, and that was a real solution for the I-15 front runner corridor. What are we going to do? So we engaged in quite a few discussions during that time. 2015 was rolling around, the next RTP update. We had a lot of discussions. Do we put a project in there? One of the early projects that UDOT looked at was double-decking I-15. Do we just include that in the RTP? Well, I can tell you there wasn't much appetite, to be honest, except for our structural engineering division on the 4th floor at UDOT for double-decking the freeway. And so we started, and you can't blame them. They're structural engineers and they love to build stuff, right? You can't blame them at all. But I think there was general recognition from all the groups, citizens, policymakers, that we really didn't want to double deck I-15. So we said, okay, well, how do we figure out what that solution is? Because we're more and more coming to the realization that it's not about projects and it's not about mode specifically, right? It's about solution sets, if you will. Going back to my mathematical day or my math days, right? You've got a bracket, you've got a solution set, A, B, C, D, E. There's a whole series of things that we need to accomplish in order to solve our transportation problems at a system level. So that was really about planning differently. The other thing that we did is, I think you mentioned it, Trustee Holbrook, everybody has an answer, right? And to be honest, I think in our business, we are guilty, have been guilty, not just here, but nationally, of beginning with the end in mind and then kind of reverse engineering the process to get where we thought we should be anyway. So one of the fundamental rules of this process is there is no predetermined outcome. Nothing is on the table, but nothing is off the table. We are going to look at everything under the sun. We're going to look at it, if I may use the term, agnostically, not advocating a position or a mode or an outcome. We're going to be rigorous, and the key at the end is to provide our policymakers with the information that they need in order to make a decision about this corridor. So, Steve, if I can just correct you a little bit, it was not UDOT-led. It was led by UDOT, UTA, Wasatch Front Regional Council, Mountain Land Association of Governments, with help from our federal partners at the Federal Highway Administration. We actually won a Tiger planning grant for this, about a $700,000, $800,000 planning grant for this effort. It was unique in that we had a UDOT project manager actually running the day-to-day, the administrative side of it, but this project manager worked for all 4 agencies. And we made that abundantly clear to her. She was a Region 2 project manager, and we made it abundantly clear to all of the agencies. And then there was a management committee. Ruling by committee sometimes is difficult, especially when you have Ted Knowlton, Sean Seeger, myself, and G.J. Labonte sitting around the table, all opinionated people. And it took some time. But it really was a collaborative effort, and I don't think we could have come up with the solution that we did without that partnership. So this was kind of the general area. If you can see, it was basically southern Davis County to northern Utah County. We had just finished the I-15 core project in Utah County, and there was a little bit of reluctance to go in and say, oh, well, we need to plan it again. We just finished a multi-billion-dollar project down there. So we kind of just focused on the central Wasatch area. You've all seen this, the challenge in the future. I won't spend a lot of time. I do love this picture, though. It is kind of cool. And it shows the I-15 front runner corridor, not necessarily in the middle of the valley, but you can see it there. And y'all know it, lots more people coming and not much space. I think you've all seen these. These are Kem Gardner Policy Institute projections for the counties of Box Elder, Davis, Salt Lake, Utah, and Weber. That's a lot of people coming in the next little while, and a lot of them are coming to Utah County as well. I think Utah County is projected to be larger than Salt Lake County when we hit these numbers at the end. Planning differently, we talked about it a little bit. So I love this slide as well. So this is, I would say, the current configuration of I-15, but we continue to modify the current configuration of I-15. We have a Adeline project going south now on I-15 through the valley, but essentially this is it. 7 lanes, 7 southbound lanes, 6 northbound lanes. So if we continue to do things the way we've done them in the past, right? 2050, here's our answer. 10 southbound lanes, 10 northbound lanes. It's just not possible to do that. What a lot of people don't realize is that the marginal efficiency of an additional travel lane starts to go down at around 3 or 4 lanes. So we really are as wide as we should get on I-15 right now. That efficiency is diminished because of weaving, getting over to the exit lanes, getting over to the HOV lanes. So you really lose that efficiency. So this really is not a practical solution. Well, if you can't go out, and please interrupt if you've got questions. If you can't go out, let's go up, back to my structural division on the 4th floor, right? And so, again, this, and by the way, that was on the table. We did look at double-decking I-15. Again, nothing was off the table. Everything was on the table.
Jeff, can I ask a question?
Please.
Because in my prior role in working with a lot of, especially the cities off the corridor, the east-west movement, so like even if you double-decked it, today it's already challenging on that east-west movement. I mean, I assume that was taken into account in looking at options.
Right. Carlton, you raise Trustee Christensen, you raise an excellent point. It's even if we did double deck it, the capacity of our arterials to deliver traffic to it, it's just not there. 90th South, if you go there in the AM or the PM peak, we already could stand to have 3 left turns onto northbound I-15 in the PM peak going, but the ramps just can't handle it and the flow just can't handle it. So that is an excellent point. We, to a large extent, believe the east-west problem is a north-south problem. If you look at the origins and destinations, just to go on that for a little bit, most of the people in the west part of the valley, and in particular the southwest part of the valley, are coming north, and they're going to the northeast in the university area. So that's why UDOT's focused on grade separating Bangor Highway and the Mountain View Corridor, is we really believe those facilities will take a lot of pressure off of the east-west and SR 111 as well. Excellent point. Oops, I went backwards. So, one of the things that we did with this study that I think is unique is, again, starting with a contextual understanding of the corridor. What are we trying to accomplish? Looking at it through multiple lenses, not just a transportation lens, but looking at it through an economic lens, looking at it through a community lens, health, air quality. And the transportation goals are important. And usually, when I was young and people started saying mission, vision, and goals, I would roll my eyes and even roll my head. But they really are important because they really shape how agencies in particular view the community, view the world, right? If UDOT viewed the world as V over C and delay, guess what solutions you would get? We are changing that ship. We don't look at the world that way anymore. So what we tried to do with all the partners is come up with these 8 goals. Improve safety is an interesting one. Increase person throughput is one that I'm going to talk a little bit more about. Improve travel time reliability. Reliability is important. There's a difference between reliability and delay. And people say, if I could just get reliable travel, that would be okay. But my executive director says, yes, true, but a 3-hour reliable commute is really not an option either. So there's that trade-off between reliability, and roadway reliability is different than transit reliability as well. Increase accessibility to jobs and education. That's access to opportunity, really. Improve air quality, obviously. Again, economic outcomes. Reduce household transportation costs. There's an interesting one where I think we have an opportunity to change things with connected autonomous vehicles, TNCs. That changing environment, I think, is going to change the vehicle ownership dynamic in this country. You know, I'll digress just a little bit on the reduced household transportation costs, and Matt and I have debated this issue at length. How are people making decisions? I would say in our valley, the majority of our residents own a vehicle. I own a vehicle. I would love not to own a vehicle, but I do own it. And so I view the ownership cost as a sunk cost. Where people are making their decisions about what mode and how they travel is on the marginal cost, right? What is that marginal cost to make a specific trip? And I think that's where we need to focus our attention, at least in the short term, and change that dynamic around. The canyons are a great example. It doesn't cost me anything to drive my car up there. on a ski day. But what's a ski route, or what's the ski bus up and down? It's $9 round trip. Thank you. We got, yeah, awesome. But $9, so free to take my car up, marginal cost, but $9 to take the transit. And then you have the convenience factor on there. That needs to be reversed, right? And so one of the things that we looked at in this are pricing strategies, policy levers that we could pull. No fare transit, congestion pricing. We'll talk a little bit about those as we come on, because those are important tools. And then improved mode balance. There was also a great discussion about, should there be a massive transit goal coming out of this? And we, again, a lot of heated discussion. As you know, we have a great partnership, but it is not always a love fest. There are heated discussions that take place. But to me, that's good, because the partnership allows those heated discussions to happen. But should there be a huge transit goal in this? And we all decided, no, there shouldn't be. But improved mode balance gets to that, right? Again, we were trying to be agnostic, not advocating, be rigorous, thorough, and transparent.
Well, while you were still on this slide, thanks, Jeff. I apologize. But I wanted to ask you a question that I think ties back actually to the reduced household transportation costs. And structurally, are you taking a look at some of the demographics that are impacting those types of decision-making things that people are doing now? For instance, you hear anecdotally that millennials are less likely to own a vehicle, or less likely to get there. I have a teenager who is not as keen as I know I was to get a driver's license. And are those factors as well in these decisions and how you're looking at not just the household transportation costs, which is big, but also everything in addition to that?
My sense, and I'm sure we could spend an hour discussing this, my sense is we looked at the millennials as the great hope for the future of shifting travel patterns. My sense is, though, millennials are delaying buying a car, they are delaying getting married, but when they do, they're tending to go to the suburbs, single-family detached homes. They're buying their cars, and they're traveling just like, I was just about to age myself. I'm the last of the baby boomers, but really I'm a Gen Xer. But just like we did as the baby boomers, right? We went to the suburbs, we bought our homes. So again, I think there's a lot of dynamics out there. And to me, at the end of the day, regardless of whether you're talking organizationally or culturally, you get the behaviors that our system incentivizes at the end of the day. So that's what we're trying to do, is change those incentives that will make people opt to change their behavior as well. So complicated slide. So this goes back to the person throughput. If you look at my left, or stage right, if you will, just to further complicate things, you have the AM peak. And on the right side, my right, you have PM peak hour. Then you have northbound, southbound for each section, and then you've got the various modes underneath that. So this is showing the seat utilization of the various modes in the corridor. The faded bar is the capacity. The darker bar is the actual seat utilization. So you can see the track's red line is maxed for capacity in the AM PM peak. But what's interesting to this is if you look at I-15 and you look at the capacity of I-15 in terms of seat utilization rather than in terms of lanes of traffic, my goodness, look at that. There is a ton of capacity on I-15 right now. And the beauty about this slide, is it allowed us to change the conversation with our policymakers. We actually presented this presentation to the Legislative Interim Committee that was shaking out Senate Bill 136 over the couple of years ago. We were actually able to go in the legislative setting and talk about policy levers to affect that. So do we double deck I-15 to add capacity, or do we try to utilize those seats? That's where things like congestion pricing come in. And what I mean by congestion pricing is not just a hot lane where we allow people to travel in the HOV lane, but price all general purpose lanes and charge accordingly based on the use of that. Peak period, you charge more, for example. When we modeled that, it had a huge impact in shifting non-work trips out of the peak period time. Just a small example, and if I'm running too long, just let me know. But Friday morning commutes, right, is a lot easier than a Tuesday, Wednesday, or largely because there's a lot of, most of the non-work trips really don't travel on a Friday morning for whatever reason. But if you look at the difference in volumes, it's really only a 4% difference. So again, to me, that's a margin that we should be able to handle, either through, clearly through more transit, but clearly through these policy levers as well. And so it allowed us to have the discussion with the legislature, members of the legislature, about these policy levers without getting thrown out, arrested, run out on a rail out of the state of Utah, hung from the highest yard arm. 10 years ago, we could not have this discussion. But what better market mechanism, quite frankly, to charge the true cost to consume a good at the point of consumption? From an economic perspective, it's very clear that if you have distortions in pricing, you have distortions in consumption. And I think there's a strong argument to say that we have distortions in pricing both on the land side and on the transportation side. And so those are some of the things that, just the dialogue that we want to raise and the questions we want to raise, just so we can start that dialogue. But it's a very telling graph. We created 3 scenarios. Again, the idea was not to come out with one and say this is the best. It was really about being able to explain the opportunity cost of investing one way versus another. And so the 3 scenarios ranged from manage more travel to, we call it our build baby scenario. Scenario 3, we threw everything in, including the kitchen sink. Double-decking I-15, you name it, we had it in there. And then the idea was to look at the life cycle cost of those, present those to our policymakers so that they can then make an educated decision about how we want to invest our money. That's the taxpayers' money. However, we did come up with a hybrid mobility solution that we call, and that was where we took the best element of the 3 solutions and put them together. The most important thing that came out of this, in my opinion, was the discussion about solution sets, and getting away from that project and that mode-specific discussion. I am firmly convinced that there is no way to solve travel demand in that corridor without that solution. Transit absolutely has to be there. Commuter rail, in my opinion, is where we get that real capacity in the corridor. Yeah, it costs a lot of money to double track and electrify commuter rail, and we may not get the ridership right at that point, but what that enables us to do is, from that point forward, the marginal cost to expand that capacity is relatively minor. Yeah, we'd have to build stations and increase them. Yeah, we'd have to add more trains in there. But thinking about the marginal cost as opposed to tearing down a freeway and rebuilding it to add a couple lanes or adding a double deck on I-15, it's significantly less. Doesn't mean it's free, but, and so to me, commuter rail is an essential part of that. And so, quite frankly, are the policy levers that we talked about. This is all of the pieces that are in the hybrid mobility solution, and I won't ask you to go through them all, and I'm not going to go through those. But really, a couple of them had a major impact. Congestion pricing had a huge impact on the roadways. It drove people started making different decisions, non-work trips during the peak times, and it pushed them to the edge. Awesome. Perfect. No fare transit had a significant impact on ridership, significant impact. And we believe those 2 combined have the potential. I know there's a lot of issues with no fare transit, and I know that's somewhat of a sensitive issue at the Utah Transit Authority. And we're not saying that no fare is the correct answer, but it's a policy option that I think we could explore to start changing behavior as well. The other big impacts were definitely double tracking, electrifying commuter rail, and increased frequency. It was all those had a pretty big step. So, at the end of the day, that would, for me, the message was it's all about a solution. Transit is important. The roadway improvements are important. Active transportation is critical in the corridor. We cannot solve this one agency alone at a time. Questions?
I do have a question, and Kim probably already knows this answer, but how would you go about implementing congestion pricing?
Great question. Probably one of the biggest drawbacks of this study, to be honest, is we didn't have a set implementation strategy to deal with this. our thought was, let's do the study, and then the components of it would be part of the 2019 RTP updates, which is happening this spring.
Yeah.
To me, Trustee Christensen, it's all about starting the dialogue. I think where we are now is the result of 20 years of, going all the way back to 1996 QGET, right? Quality Growth Efficiency Tools, which spawned Envision Utah, which our planning community, I spent 11 years at this organization pushing very hard for transit and those policies. I think that dialogue, you need to start the dialogue. I think it's, at the end of the day, it's showing slides like that seat utilization slide and just saying from a fiscal conservative approach, why would I spend $5 billion to double deck a freeway when I can implement a policy lever that accomplishes the same thing? Yeah, okay, I as a user may have to pay more, but clearly it'll be a lot less burden to the taxpayers of the Wasatch Front. And I think it's just continuing to make that discussion and pointing those things out. But it's going to take time.
Yeah.
I wish I had a clear path.
No, I mean, I was just thinking, when I took my job here, I signed up for your Express Pass so that I could get off northbound at 4 South and not feel guilty.
Right.
and it helps on occasion if I'm late for a meeting. But I do go through that sort of, kind of like your HSA. You decide, is getting in this lane worth it to me, versus, what are my other alternatives? And I realized the legislature just went through some restructuring of taxes, and I wouldn't even begin to say doing it. But I think going down the long term, that system actually works very well, and it's very equitable, and it varies depending on the loads on the freeway, and you make your economic choice, but it brings that into the decision factor, and I think at some point, and I think we have to think about fares, and I know we're planning to have a more extensive discussion on fares and how that. And it'd be interesting to try to figure out if those two at some point could coincide.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
One of the interesting things that, back to the path forward is the roadway user charge. The legislature directed UDOT to implement a pilot roadway user charge. And we're kind of using the electric vehicle element now to do that. You either pay an increased registration fee or you pay by the miles that you travel.
Yeah.
Toll or roadway user charge to a large extent is being viewed as a revenue tool. Congestion pricing is not a revenue tool. It's a travel demand management tool. But if you think about the smart ruck, where we're using the technology in our cars, the infotainment centers that are in our cars, there's a ton of information being processed. Think of the policy levers that you could pull if you had a smart pricing system that was based on time, axle weight, vehicle type, electric, natural gas. Each one of those could be charged differently depending on what the overall objectives of the state are. And so there'd just be a whole host of pricing mechanisms that way. And that's where I would like to see it go. Personal opinion is that smart, clearly privacy issues have to be resolved, but that would allow us to do a lot of things.
Yeah. Let's see, I saw somebody's. Ken?
Well, you asked about congestion pricing. One of the easiest ways, because technology is not there, as much as we'd like to see it there, is to just make 2 HOV lanes on the freeway. Double the size of the HOV lanes. And now we've got 2. We don't widen the freeway, but we make it more available for people that want to pay the price, and that would be perhaps the easiest way, because all it takes is restriping.
Right. That's a great comment. In fact, putting 2 HOV lanes is actually part of that overall hybrid mobility solution. The other thing that allows us to do in the future is be flexible and repurpose those lanes. So when we get to level 5 connected and autonomous vehicles, if I have 2 HOV lanes that are barrier separated, for example, I can operate those as level 5 connected autonomous vehicle lanes on the freeway, and then operate the other lanes as just regular lanes as fleet turnover happens.
Beth?
Thank you. Excuse me. I just wanted to make a comment about, and I'm not an engineer, but I have lived in. I'm not a recovering engineer or anything like that, but I've lived in earthquake country, and one of the components that I think is interesting in the dynamics of all of this is when you're talking about, double decking and things like that. I think that that has to be a factor in our decision making process, and a lot of times, people understand that inherent dynamic of what's that tipping point as to where you decide to where you spend your money. And I really liked your point. So in other words, I'm against double decking just simply on that perspective because I've just seen what it does on the other side. But I really liked your perspective of, utilizing in essence the structural footprints that we already have in our existence right now and how we can maximize those and utilize that in a way that is going to actually be more efficient long term. And I think that you articulated that very well. So that was my comment, just no double decking. Anyway.
Right, and being able to repurpose that footprint.
Correct,
Who knows
yes.
what's going to happen in 15 years from now, and we should be flexible enough to repurpose that footprint if necessary.
Steve, anything else for today's portion?
That's today. Just try to set the table a little bit for our future discussions.
That's great.
Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Jeff. I'm just going to take a little bit of prerogative, and we're going to take a 7-minute break. So we'll come back at 10:40 and just give people a chance to stretch their backs and use the restroom if needed. All right, we're back, and our next item, excuse me, up for discussion is the capital project's 5-year plan process. And Mary Delaretto.
Hey, good morning. Thank you. Oops. So I'm going to talk about our capital project budget process and how we develop our annual budget and how now we're going to be developing our 5-year plan. So the capital project budget process applies to all construction projects, all capital maintenance and major equipment purchases over $25,000, and it also applies to our IT and our safety projects over $25,000. And we're moving now from an annual budget plan to a 5-year plan. And we started actually assembling the 5-year project request last year and even maybe the year before, but we hadn't been at a place to actually have the 5-year plan. But I think we're at a place now where we could start putting this 5-year plan together. And having that 5-year plan, it helps mitigate some of the challenges of applying a 1-year budget to a multi-year project, and also to projects that have long lead items that they might have to order this year and they might not come, parts might not come till the following year. And so as we are collecting and assembling all our projects, then we evaluate them and rank them per our prioritization criteria. So this is the prioritization criteria that we plan to use, and we'd welcome any input you folks have on this list. But we always want to ensure that we have a safe system. We want to maintain a state of good repair of our existing facilities. And then we want to leverage grant and partner funds whenever we can. If we know of a grant, or if we have a local partner entity that wants to help pay for something, we want to be able to leverage that. And then also any needed system improvements. So here is how a project would get onto our list of requests. We put together these forms. Right now they're just paper copies, but what we're planning on doing, we're getting them into the Laserfiche system, so they'll be electronically approved and moved forward. So the initial project request is just a basic, here's what I think, and anybody could submit the initial project request to their manager, and it just would be a description of what the project it is and why we think it's needed, an initial cost estimate, when they think it should start and end, and where they think if there is any potential from outside sources of funding to list it there. Then that would go to their manager and then their executive for approval. And if they say, yep, this looks like a decent project, then it would go back and they'd prepare a detailed project request. And that's more where we give, really, how does this align with our mission and goals and our priorities? What are the benefits of this project? What objectives is it meeting? And then we ask them to break down the capital cost by year. So if it's a multi-year project, identify how much they think would be spent in each year. And we also ask that they include, we haven't done it a lot in the past, but we've been starting to do it. We want to understand, how does this impact operations? What would the O&M cost be associated with this? And then any state of good repair cost for future consideration. And if they have any funding sources identified, this is where we ask them to list it and the amounts. And so then that, again, goes back to the manager and the chiefs for approval. And if that gets approved, then it gets onto our 5-year request list.
Mary, excuse me, can I ask, on the initial request, is there, since it's a 5-year, is anything sort of proactively put on there saying, like, we're going to need this in 5 years? Or are we assuming that everything that is there is, in essence, deferred or immediate capital needs?
We have asked, when we asked for a 5-year last year, we said, please give us anything you want for next year and anything you anticipate in the next 5 years. So we have been asking for that. So we've already assembled most of the list for the next 5 years, and we've identified expenditure by year and funding sources. We're still working on identifying all the funding sources for each of those projects. And then we're going to have to run it through our prioritization process. So we are setting, each year we set a date for when we want all these submittals to come in, if they want it to be included in next year's fiscal budget. If they want something for a future year, they could submit it any time and we'll get it on the list. We'll maintain that 5-year list. It'll be a rolling 5-year, but if they want it in next year's fiscal budget, then they have to get it by the deadline, and each year a deadline is set. This year we're asking April 1st just because this is our first year trying to assemble this 5-year one, so it's a lot sooner than normal, but like I said, we already had a good start at the assembling the 5-year request. And then also if there's some emergency or unforeseen items, we can consider adding them to the budget as needed during the year. So this slide kind of shows how our new capital projects, the process we discussed a couple of weeks ago, how the new capital projects would be incorporated into the 5-year plan. So again, you know, we mentioned how the capital plan would be developed, the LPA and the funding plan, and then it would go to the advisory board for review and approval. And if they approve it, it would go to the board for review and approval. And then at that point, that project would be incorporated into our 5-year plan with the funding scenario that had been approved.
Is there in there any list of projects that were asked for that management didn't want to recommend? I mean, I guess I'm always interested in looking at the stuff that didn't get recommended and why. And
are you talking about
back
the capital projects specifically, or the main list?
Was originated, do you keep track of any of those, or do they just get lost by the manager if he didn't want, if he or she doesn't want it? Or?
They often come back. They do, but you know what was unfunded. You know, similar to what you see on the long range plans from the regional council and MAG, that they do carry those unfunded ones forward. Okay. Now, you'd go through a process with an alternative analysis and the environmental. You kind of cull down to that preferred alternative for that specific solution. But there's a lot of projects. As you can imagine, there's more projects than we have budget for. And so we are keeping track of those. And, you know, as situations change and priorities change, those will move in and out of the list.
Okay. But they're tracked somewhere.
They are.
Yeah, so here's just the flow chart of how we get the budget finalized. So once we get our list of projects, we sit as a group. The senior level managers would meet together who have the projects, and we would rank them based on needs and importance and how much funding we have, and it's a hard process. We really have to cut a lot of things because we have to fit within our budget. And then once that group has developed this 5-year plan for those funds, then that step's not shown here, but it would go to the executive level first for their review and approval. And if they need to make any necessary changes, then it would go to the advisory board for their consultation. After that, it would go to this board for your review and approval. And if you approve of that 5-year plan, the first year, the next fiscal year, would then be taken and incorporated into the overall capital budget for UTA for the year. And then again, once that capital budget has been assembled, it would go for public comment, and then advisory board consultation, and then final board approval.
If the budget changes, something comes up and you have to modify it, does it have to go back to the advisory board again? I'm trying to remember.
I am not sure.
Okay.
That's under discussion right now.
Okay. I wasn't sure whether the statute says, they advise on basically a prioritization of the projects versus the actual budgeting piece, and that's
So if you could go back a slide. There's a requirement that the advisory board look at new capital development projects. And if you go forward a slide, there is a requirement that they review the annual budget.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, and I just might add that the statute requires the advisory board to approve capital plans and funding. And so this process does create that transparency and check in with them for that longer term planning. And I think with regard to capital amendments, those are maybe policy things we can look at and how maybe thresholds that we want to look at.
Okay, that was my presentation. Did anybody have any more questions or?
Any questions, Beth?
I just had a quick question, and I think Steve kind of answered it in the sense that what is the justifications when the initial project comes on board, and does that justification, do we rank justifications? And I think that probably dovetails with what you were saying, but I just kind of wanted to.
So, what are the goals and objectives? What are the strategic objectives of the board and for the agency, and how do these projects meet that? Or do they keep us in operation? You can imagine major software overhauls. The traveling public doesn't see the benefit of that, but it may allow us to pay our employees and manage our financial system or manage some aspect of the operations. So we have to look at it from that standpoint. I think what I hope to get out of this is a little bit of flexibility. A project manager, somebody, the executive that pulls the project forward and it gets rated, and we can really look at how to schedule that and manage it through the design process. In the past, the emphasis was, I got to get it in that year, and I got to get as much as I can in that year. Realistically, not being able to accomplish it in that year. So we're allocating capital funds towards that with somewhat of an understanding we can't spend it in that year. So we've tied up those dollars, whereas if we would give people consideration over a 5-year or a rolling plan, they can spend the right amount of money and dedicate the right amount of money in each year more efficiently. Have time to do the environmental, have time to do the design, have time to advance purchase materials. Like rail and switches, things like that, have very long lead items. The $500,000 that we're going to do this summer, we purchased those materials last year, and it took over a year to acquire and get those materials. So give that flexibility, and then managing capital development will be managing these projects, seeing how they're going with scope, schedule, and budget. So if we do need a reallocation of resources, a project for some reason didn't advance as much as we thought, we could change a little bit of those priorities within the year and give a project that needed more resources so that we can continue to move the program forward, use those dollars, not get them eaten up by inflation, and be more productive in our capital program.
I mean, one thought I was just having as Steve was talking is, and maybe it exists. I've not really gone through the formation process here yet, but I wonder if in the capital plan, but I've seen this like in other places where we had a contingency budget, so adjustments could be made later on, but and particularly in being respectful to the advisory board as they review the thing. I mean, just an acknowledgement that this is a contingency budget. As long as we're not shifting projects in and out of the plan without having them have a chance to review, they just know that we have budgetary authority, and that's that component of it. And we would have to have reasons, and we'd go through our own board process to decide if we're going to pull from it or not, because but it would allow projects to move along, I would think, in a more timely way. And yet be respectful.
And we have a few what we're calling pools, like an equipment pool. So when a need comes up, then they would go to that project manager who manages that, and he would prioritize those equipment needs, or an IT pool where they say, here's something that just came up that we need. So we do have that kind of consideration.
Yeah. I was just thinking over an overall one that, if you had a major shift, you'd go back and decide which projects you were going to postpone or push back a year or something. But it would allow you some flexibility, I think.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Mary. Next is our bus stop master plan with Laura Hansen. Welcome.
Welcome. Thank you, Mr. Chair and trustees. I'm excited to be here with you all today. As you know, we have been working on a whole variety of service planning tools. I've talked to you about the service planning policy and given you kind of an overview on some of the other pieces we're working on. The bus stop master plan is another piece of this toolbox that's helping us guide our service planning decisions to be objective and transparent, consistent in the way we approach things. We're not quite complete or finished with this project yet, but I wanted to give you an update on where we were, mostly because I know this is a topic that is on a lot of your minds and keeps coming up in conversations with community members. And so I wanted to give you a hint on where we were headed. We think that our timeline is to complete this around by the end of April. We want to do some internal vetting as well as some external vetting. So meeting with some of our community partners, asking them, do you feel like this meets your needs as a community? Does this align with what you think your priorities might be? And then also the same with our bus regional general managers. We've been kind of calibrating the tools within this to align that with their, they know their systems best, right? And so they know where the biggest needs are and make sure that our processes are resulting in consistent feedback. So as a quick overview, we serve more than 2 million people along the Wasatch Front. 44% of the population of the Wasatch Front is within 1/4 mile of a bus stop. In a lot of ways, really, the bus stops are the community's first impression and first introduction to UTA, whether they ride transit service or not. You see them everywhere, right? And so it's really kind of our front door to our system. And I've got a stat on there from January of 2018, but I actually have an updated number here. In 2018, we had 6,346 bus stops in our system. As of January 2019, we have 6,020. So you'll see we dropped about 100 or 320. Part of that is we have this great inventory of our bus stops, and we found that about 300 of them were not being used at all. Nobody ever got on, nobody ever got off. They had just been there for a long time, and we thought, okay, maybe we don't need to keep these in our system. Stopping periodically, it helps speed up the system a little bit, and if they're not being used, then let's not include something that we need to maintain. So that's why the change there. In 2016, we had an amazing intern that went through our entire bus network, inventoried every single bus stop in our system. They took photos of them, recorded whether they were ADA accessible, did they have a shelter, was there a bench, did they have heaters or trash cans. So we now have this amazing database of every single bus stop in our system, noting the amenities that are available, the conditions of the stops, and a photo, and it's all geo-referenced, which has turned out to be a really wonderful tool for us, and we're grateful for interns for being able to help with that. And what we found is that, consistent with a 50-year-old bus system, not all of our bus stops are meeting today's current standards. I would compare this to, I live in the community of Mill Creek. We don't have sidewalks on a lot of our streets in Mill Creek. Cities grow, expectations and standards change over time. A lot of these bus stops have been here for a really long time. Prior to the enactment of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So they've been grandfathered in. We're fully in compliance with all federal regulations right now. But as you can see, we can do a little bit better for our customers than some of the current bus stops. So with 6,000 bus stops to take care of, we felt like we really needed a plan to be able to work towards improving those and bringing them up to what we think are our very best standards and serving our customers the best. So we are working on putting together a plan. And what you see on the screen here is a series of 7 different bus stop amenity levels. So not every single bus stop warrants 2 benches and a shelter and lights and digital signage. And so we've basically taken, based on frequency, and what's not shown here is there's a 1A and B, 2A and B based on frequency. But we've come up with levels of amenities based on how heavily used the bus stops are. So we don't need to do the Cadillac version or the Tesla version at every single stop. But we've developed a plan, and I think the idea here is now we have a tool. We can build partnerships with our local governments. We can leverage dollars. We can prioritize our own funding to make sure that we're making the investments in the appropriate places and the places where we get the biggest bang for our buck. And so the bus stop master plan.
Laura, can I ask you a question?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Do you have any sense or anybody analyze that after a bus stop has been upgraded, whether it's changed the boardings at that location or?
Yeah, it's interesting that you should ask that. Actually, one of our former board members and a professor at the University of Utah, Keith Bartholomew, has been working with some graduate students, and they've done a lot of research about this, actually. Specifically, they were looking at bus stops along 2nd South that have been upgraded, and they found a lot more people using them. And interestingly, they also found a correlation to an increase of people with disabilities using those stops and moving away from the more expensive paratransit service and onto the regular mainstream service. Partly, they think maybe because of these amenities. There's a lot of caveats and there's a lot of questions about whether people just moved from one bus stop to another, and that's why we're seeing more there. So more research to be done. I don't think we can call it conclusive evidence, but I think anecdotally, we can all say that's a much more pleasant experience.
I realize it's not the reason you would necessarily update one, but I just was thinking as you look to prioritization, if it increased ridership in an aggregate way, what it might be, we always look at other ways to increase ridership, and sometimes the convenience factor we sometimes look past, and it's sometimes the simplest solution. Yeah. To getting there, but anyway.
We're very lucky that we have a super talented analytics team here at UTA, and now that we have this plan in place, I think starting forward, once we have this plan and we start making improvements based on this, we can start tracking and seeing if we're seeing some on a gross magnitude level changes and trends between these various different bus stops. So things included in the plan are best practices for bus stop spacing, their sighting. For example, it works better for our operations if the bus stops are on the far side of the intersection, so you get through the traffic signal and then pull over. It just helps keep the system moving. Amenity levels, meeting federal regulations, of course, and then also thinking about the customer experience. What's the best lighting, information? Are we following CPTED principles, which is crime prevention through environmental design? Do you have good sight lines and visibility? How accessible are the sites? And then we have some standard designs. I think we find increasingly that we have a lot of communities and other partners that want to help us with this. And so we now have some standards that we can give them and say, okay, here's a basic design that meets our needs and is compliant, and we'd love your help pouring that concrete pad. So with 6,000 bus stops and a bunch of different levels, we need to figure out which ones to improve, right? We have limited resources. And so we've put together a prioritization matrix here that looks at a bunch of different categories and assigns points. And I won't go through this in detail because I know it's complicated, but basically it's how many people are using the bus stop, how many different bus routes transfer or facilitate or come to that same stop. So total stop activity, number of routes there, is it serving a Title VI minority or low income population? Safety considerations. If we know there's a safety problem, obviously we need to take care of that first. We've also been looking at some things in terms of how it fits into the community. Is it adjacent to an educational institution, a school, or a library? And then one thing that we've just recently added is the number of wheelchair ramp deployments at different stops as well can help us understand which ones are the highest priorities. And so this is a work in progress. Again, we're continuing to vet this. In fact, Lauren Simpson gave us some really great feedback on this, and we're going to keep going through that with our different RGMs and make sure that the list that it spits out of priorities feels right and passes the smell test. And I just wanted to end with a great shout out and some before and after pictures. This is a bus stop, and of course, I don't know the location, 612. Thank you very much, Eddie. Thank you, Eddie. Great before and after, and a shout out to our bus stop administrator, Robert Brotherson. Also, Joe Taylor on my staff worked very heavily on this bus stop master plan. GJ Labonte has helped a lot, as well as Eric Callison. So they do great work, and if you can look at the difference between this and this, we can provide much better service to our communities and our customers. And it takes resources, of course, but I think it makes a big difference. So thank you. Do you have any questions?
Let me start with Beth.
Thank you. Thanks, Laura, for that presentation. It's really great to see how we're trying to integrate that and incorporate that within our communities. I did have a question, though, in terms of how do we get this information to individual communities, and how do we integrate that so that if there's hey, this city, whatever city this is, maybe it's Ogden, this city wants to do this type of a format. How do we connect with them and let them know what we can do?
Well, I think, historically we've been kind of reactive because we haven't had a plan like this in place to facilitate those conversations. And so whenever there was a complaint or somebody would call and say, oh, our bus stops you guys can do better, right? And we'd say, yeah, we can probably do better. And so we'd work with them. I think now that we have a tool, you're right on the dot there, that we need to be more proactive in getting out to our communities. So I'm hopeful that we can work with you all as you're meeting with your local government partners and the areas that you represent, to let them know that this is a tool that's available to us. Trustee Christensen and I have met with a couple of communities recently where this has come up. But I think there are also some organizations and existing meeting groups like the MPO planning committees and their technical committees. There's a plan pack group that Salt Lake County has helped to organize. And I think those are all forums where we can say, hey, you know what, we've got some great new tools out there. These are the top 10 bus stops in your community. If you have a road reconstruction project happening, that's a great opportunity for us to partner and leverage and maximize our dollars. Or if you're working with a developer, for example, if a site's being redeveloped, they're out doing work already, maybe we could coordinate, now that you know where our priority bus stops are, and have them pour the concrete while they're doing that as well. So lots of great opportunities, but we do need to get it out in front of people, and that's the next step.
One question I had, and I don't know, maybe either Laura or Steve, you might know, but sometimes there's a cost to sort of a contractor becoming familiar and knowing how to do these, and once they get it down, they can sometimes go in and just do it quickly and not have a huge mobilization piece to it. I mean, is there any thought on the capital planning side, like if you had an infusion of some money, how you could maybe do some of these even maybe a little more efficient than historically, or do we do it totally efficient?
It's not ever 100%. There's always room for improvement. But right now we have an on-call construction contract, and we have tasked them. Part of their work is bus stops. So they have a dedicated crew. They're working with concrete contractors. Just exactly what you said. We're trying to give them tools once we've done the planning work on the construction side. You can see like this example. We have to meet the ADA requirements. So this required a slight ramp, towards the front of the screen on the front of the slide to get down to that level. That's critically important that ramp meet the ADA requirements, and we structure it in such a way that there's still the proper maneuvering room to get a person in the wheelchair or the stroller up to the bus stop, and leaving enough room from a shelter. And so spending a lot of time going through that training to get contractors on board and get them educated about all the requirements, so that, in some of these, like this one, not a lot of engineering time. A field crew could go out and lay this out. Others require a significant amount. There may be a slight retaining wall, and it requires some engineering. A park strip in a residential or even a business area might have a sprinkler line. There's utilities to deal with. There's all of that. And it's amazing how the cost of a bus stop can add up. Now we put a garbage can there and a shelter that needs to be maintained. So our facilities maintenance crew have to add that to their list. We have about, I think our ratio is about one maintenance person per 70 bus stops, or less than that. Yeah, probably less than that. I can't remember. 50?
50.
I think Eddie's here.
So there's a truck and, associated resources allocated with that. So there's a lot goes into these. They are important. And then, when the service choices study goes in, if we talk about consolidating bus stops or moving those, it's a more significant cost when you got to bring it up to ADA standards. So if we move a bus stop now, we need to bring that up to ADA requirements. So there's that pad that goes in and all of that. It's not insignificant. It's really important, and it's important to a lot of our customers. I love the idea of our disabled, ability challenged folks being able to move off of the paratransit into our regular system. They love that. It's so much more accessible. They have more areas, more freedom of when they can get in and ride when we make these stops accessible.
And I would think, and I don't, I guess that that'd be factored into your deployment numbers, but we always think about when they're getting on, but they're probably also making the decision based on whether or not they can get off at a place that can deploy and get them off safely. And so I think, I love the idea of somehow factoring that in fairly aggressively. So, good.
Thank you very much.
Hey, thank you. Appreciate all your efforts thus far. The next item, item F, is the Utah Compact. I think many may have remembered a chamber-led effort a number of years ago to deal with and to address some of the immigration issues and some of the needs in the community, including businesses and a worker-based having a broad worker base, as well as just the humanity and equity and efforts of a lot of folks that are part of the fabric of our communities. And the Chamber recently has asked for reaffirmation from stakeholders, and as a member of the Chamber, they've reached out to us in asking for our support, continued support of the Utah Compact. And so since it would also entail the name of the agency, I thought it was important to bring to the board and make sure first that there were no concerns with us doing that, and if there weren't, asking for a motion that we make that support. Any questions or concerns?
No, I read through the material and thought that it would be appropriate for us to continue to support this Utah Compact.
Okay. Can I?
So I would make a motion that we certainly express our desire to support the Utah Compact.
Okay.
I'd second that.
Great. A motion and a second. Seeing any other discussion? Seeing none, all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That motion passes. We'll certainly now convey that to the Chamber. Unless there's any other business that I'm missing, our next meeting will be on March 13th, and I'll entertain a motion for adjournment.
So moved.
Second. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. And we'll stand adjourned. Thank you, everybody.